clinical efforts that have been made and that need to be made in the area of PTSD, and some of the efforts that have been spearheaded by a number of very prominent, very effective individuals. Project that drew a tremendous amount of attention to the problems, psychological problems of veterans from Vietnam. And John's going to be talking with us about the history of the Vet Center project. Great, John.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to share briefly some of the history of my involvement with spearheading efforts for Vietnam veterans and their counseling and treatment, and doing it in kind of a retrospective way, looking back at how I got involved with this. I think I'd like to start by telling you the context of the setting in which my work began. I was a young assistant professor where I am now at Cleveland State University. I had just come there in 1973, and my university is an urban university in an urban city. And at the time I came to Cleveland State University, there were about 9,000 students, and of the 9,000, 2,000 were Vietnam veterans. And the way I came to understand their issues, to put it simply, was that they were different than the other students. They were different in a number of ways. They tended to sit in the back of the room. They had field jackets on, long hair. And they became demonstrably upset when I would talk in some of my courses about the work of Stanley Milgram on obedience to authority, or Larry Kohlberg's work. I did my postdoc with Larry Kohlberg at Harvard, and talk about his work on moral reasoning and moral development and moral dilemmas, about when do people do the right thing or not do the right thing in situations of moral conflict. And I talked about situations like My Lai, the Holocaust, and other real-world situations where that had happened. And when I raised these kind of issues about when you disobey authority if you think it's morally wrong, and when do you take a stand, it was evident to me that the men in my classes became agitated. They were upset. You could see it, and then they got angry. Often they would leave the classroom. So I reached out to them to talk to them, and began listening very carefully to some of the things they wanted to share with me about their war experiences in Vietnam. Now remember, this is in 1973, so the war is still fresh for most of them. They'd been back a short time from Vietnam. And it was in that context I began to sense that there were some underlying powerful emotional residues of the Vietnam experience. So in 1973, I started a project that I titled the Forgotten Warrior Project. Initially, it was an in-house project at the university where I interviewed in depth several hundred men, tape recorded the interviews. The interviews are very simple, actually. I said, I want you to tell me a little bit about what you were like before you entered military service, a little bit about your training, and then I'd like for you to walk me through your Vietnam experience chronologically if you can, and then I want to talk about how you've changed since you've come home from the war. That was sort of the basic structure of the interview. And that first year, there were so many moving stories, and I felt sort of compelled to continue on and learn more about this. But I want to be very honest and tell you there's another part of me as a young academic who had another career studying pro-social behavior in laboratory settings that was kind of torn. Do I want to continue with this sort of work, or should I go back to the safe, tried and true experimental paradigms that I'd become comfortable with through my training? I was trained both as a clinician and an experimentalist. A couple of stories that anchor this, and then I'll talk about the Forgotten Warrior Project. In my first week of teaching at the university, I had a student come to me, and he was suicidal. He came in my office and asked if he could talk to me. And he explained he was a recovering heroin addict and a recovering alcoholic, that he came from a very disrupted family, that he was homeless, he had nowhere to go, and could I help him find a place to live? Well, for whatever reasons, I had just bought a large house where I lived in my community, had a big third floor that wasn't occupied, and I offered him to come and stay at the house for a couple of weeks till he got his feet on the ground and he could get himself oriented. That fellow's name is John Burke, and he came for 2 weeks and stayed a year. And he was very helpful to me. I had just one young baby child, and I needed help with that because my wife was going to graduate school at the time. And John turned out to be really terrific. He knew how to fix everything. But 6 months into staying at my house, one night at 11 o'clock, he came and said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." And I was in my study. I was up smoking my pipe. When I used to smoke a pipe, I don't anymore, but in those days I was trying to be professorial at a young age. And he said, there's something I'd like to talk to you about. I said, what is it? He said, I did 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic. And I spent the next 5 hours listening to him. And all of a sudden things started to fall in place about his life, about his addiction, what overwhelmed him being a young combat medic, 101st Airborne in Vietnam, and so on. John went on to graduate from Cleveland State with a presidential scholarship with a 4-point average. He was a remarkable person. And his story touched me, as did so many during that period of time. So I continued on with this informal research, and I began writing research grants. And this is another interesting part of the story. I wrote 10 grants in a period of about 18 months that were submitted to various organizations and foundations, including NIMH, private foundations in Cleveland where they had a lot of money, and every letter of rejection that came back, and they were all rejected, said the same thing. This is important, it's interesting, but we don't want to fund it. And it was clear to me that the American society didn't want to deal with Vietnam, and they certainly didn't want to deal with its veterans. And I got increasingly angry about these rejections because on the one hand, as a professional and as a person, I was seeing the pain of the war. It was really transparent. You didn't have to be Sigmund Freud to figure out that there was huge emotional residue among the men who had fought the war. And so I continued on, and I was about to give up and return to the SAFE Academy when one of the guys I had interviewed, who became a very dear friend, his name was Hank Basil, he was 100% disabled. Hank was blown up by an RPG attack in November of 1970 when riding on the back of a armored personnel carrier. He was hit at point-blank range, manning the machine gun on the back of the track, and it blew him apart. Literally blew him apart. It blew his hands off, part of his arms, took off half his face. He had 70% tissue loss down to his knees, and he spent the next 4 years being reconstructed into what he was. Before he went to Vietnam, Hank was an all-state athlete in Ohio. He was a champion powerweight lifter when he volunteered for the Army, because he came from a family in Cleveland where that was something you were supposed to do. And he was 260 pounds, 6'4" when he went in, and he was 128 pounds when he came out. And I spent a lot of time talking to Hank. And about the time I was ready to quit, he came into my office and he says, "John, you can't quit. You can't quit. You can't let us down. You have to keep trying to find a way to do this study." And I said, "Hank, nobody wants to hear the stories. No one cares about doing this research right now. I'm sorry to tell you that." He says, "You've got to try to find the way." So I said, "I don't know, Hank. I'm kind of getting tired, because I understand what the issues are. But I don't know why people don't want to fund this. It's just they don't want to touch the war residue right now." So he got angry, and with his reconstructed hand, he didn't have any fingers. He had these little stubs with lots of scar tissue. He picked up the telephone, and he dialed the Disabled American Veterans here in Washington. And he asked to speak with the national commander, a guy whose name at that time was Dale Evans, himself a World War II and Korea veteran. Hank got Dale on the phone. He said, "I want you to listen to me. I'm 100% disabled. I'm a lifetime member of the DAV. And I've been working with this guy for over a year now. And he understands what's going on with us. And I want you to listen to what I have to tell you." He says, "I want you to fund research. I want you to help us Vietnam vets get what we need to have in terms of more care." So he hands me the phone, and I talk to Dale Evans. And Dale knew the right questions to ask. He was very insightful. What do you want to know? What do you want to know about? How would you go about looking at this, looking at that, and so on? He says, "Well, tell me about your design." I said, "Well, the design I'd like to have is we'd like to sample men from all branches of service who were in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and match those to controls stratified by race." That would be the initial design. And we want to use a number of different measures that are psychosocial, and some look at symptoms, and we want to look at demographics and a lot of other things. He said, "How much money do you want?" And I wasn't really prepared for that question at the moment. So I said, $50,000. He says, "I'll get back to you." And that was the end of the phone call. I went on a short vacation after that. And when I got back to my university, there was a stack of pink slips waiting for me from the Office of Research Services. And I called the head of the Office of Research Services. He says, "We have a check here for $50,000 to do the Forgotten Warrior project." And I remember my reaction. On the one hand, I was absolutely thrilled. At that time, it was the largest grant that anybody had ever gotten at my university. And that was nice. On the other hand, I went, damn, I gotta do this. Some of you can relate to that, I'm sure. Thus was born the Forgotten Warrior Project, funded by the Disabled American Veterans from that time, which was 1976 until 1981. They continued to refund me at that level at every request that I made. So we did the Forgotten Warrior Project, and in the first year we interviewed about 1,000 people. And I holed up in my office at the university with 2 assistants who were Vietnam veterans, and I hired a secretary to transcribe the tape recordings we made of the parts about the war interviews. And I still have, if anybody wants it, I still have filing cabinets full of tape recordings that have never been analyzed. Later I wrote a grant to try to get those transcribed and analyzed. I wanted to write them up into a book. It just, telling the stories, essentially, but also then analyzing them. At the end of the first year, I'd lost not only that first secretary, but 3 more because they couldn't handle the transcriptions. We had a little transcription machine in the foot pedal, and they'd go through it. And I'd find them just crying and weeping, and I'd lose them one after the other. They couldn't handle it, so we never got them all transcribed. At the end of that first year, I wrote up the preliminary results, because the DAV wanted me to come to their national headquarters in Kentucky and present the results of that study, and I did. And I remember that I still had this ambivalence, that I felt this was really important. And I also had the personal sense, and I want to share this with you, as I was going along with these interviews and conducting the studies, I was feeling myself being pulled into this chasm. And I had the sense that I was looking at the peak of this enormous iceberg that was underneath the surface. And on the one hand, it was very exciting. On the other hand, it scared me, because I could sense how immense this thing was, this thing that we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and all that goes with it. So I wrote up the preliminary results, and I took them down to the DAV headquarters, and before we went there, I had lunch in Cincinnati with my wife, and I said to her over lunch, I think this is it. I'm going to give them the report and say goodbye. So I went and did a 2-hour presentation, going through all these preliminary findings, talking about the symptom clusters that we now call PTSD and other things. And at the end of it, they said, what are you going to do next now? What needs to be done next? And I don't know where this came from. It's like, something took over me, and this something from the spirit world came down, and I said, I need another $50,000 to do that set of data analysis to answer these questions. And they said, sure, here it is. And so that was a turning point. And thus was born not only the Forgotten Warrior, but then some new initiatives. And one of the things that impressed me is that the DAV constantly kept saying, what do we need to do? What do we need to do? And so one of the things they wanted me to do was to train their national service officers in what I was learning. So I was flying to Washington about 2 times a week for many years during this period of time. And through the DAV, then I got hooked up with the VA. And by 1977, was starting to work with Max Cleland, whom all of you know was the director of the VA at the time. And actually, Jimmy Carter asked me to do that. And there's an interesting story that goes about this. There's so many stories to tell. I'm just going to have to focus on a few and then talk about the Vet Center program. I talked in front of Senator Cranston's committee in 1976, and again several times after that. And the first time I did that, it was in June, and I was very scared because it was a Senate subcommittee, and there was a lot of media there. The New York Times, all the 3 networks were there. And I talked about what I was finding. I was giving some descriptive statistics and percentages and talking about the impact and change of identity for so many Vietnam veterans, how it transformed their lives. And unbeknownst to me, that testimony was picked up and aired in lots of places. And the next morning when I was back at my university office, I got a phone call. And this person, I said, well, who is it? Said, this is the Walter Cronkite News calling. Now, I honestly thought this was a prank. I thought it was one of my friends putting me on, So they said, I said, who is this? They said, it's the Cronkite News. I was sure it was one of my best friends pranking me. So I said, who the fuck is this? And they said, hi, my name's Bill Wilson. I'm producer of 60 Minutes and also the Cronkite News. I said, oh. He said, Walter Cronkite would like to do a series on the national news about your work and what you're finding. I said, well, if you're really serious, why don't you come to Cleveland tomorrow? Because I still thought it was a prank. Well, I began to reflect on that afterwards, and maybe I shouldn't have done that. But the truth is, the next morning, 9 o'clock, Bill Wilson and crew came from CBS in New York. They planned to stay 2 days. They wanted me to find veterans who represented the cross-section, African Americans and Hispanics and disabled and so on. which we did. We didn't have any problem doing that. And they stayed 2 weeks. Not 2 days, they stayed 2 weeks. And then that aired on the national news. And then after that, then I got a call from the White House asking me if I would be advisor to President Carter and work with Max Cleland. So I said, yes, of course. And then at the same time, the DAV said, we need an outreach program. So what I designed for the DAV in 1977 and 78, implemented in 78, was a vet center program set in 66 centers around the United States, funded by the disabled American veterans. And my idea was, it came from what I actually had created in Cleveland, that came up as a spinoff of the study, that so many of the men after our interview said, I need help, where do I go? And they didn't want to go to the Cleveland VA. They had tried, and they felt rejected, they didn't get listened to, and so on and so forth. And of course, there were no problems with authority or government among these people either. So myself and a guy named Walter Kanaki, who was the chief mental health specialist at the Cleveland VA at the time, we created a vet center in Cleveland. It was sponsored by a community agency that gave us the space, and we started running rap groups. And that taught me a lot in a short period of time. It was a quick learning curve. I'll never forget the first rap group we had. I was telling Matt Friedman about this not too long ago. 14 guys show up in this group. Half of them were stoned on pot, half of them were drunk. Unbeknownst to me, they're all packing heat, And within the first hour, things get a little, really get intense. There's all this anger pouring out, and I had this sort of what I call soft confrontation with one of the guys who stormed out of the group in the heat. He says he threatened to kill me. And I thought he was just blowing smoke. And two of the guys in the group who knew him says, listen, you better watch out. This guy's already been in prison for killing people. I said, well, he's leaving. No, he's going to his car to get a gun. And I thought, well, I don't know. So I stayed anyway. I did stay. He did come back. Before he came back in the room, I went out and greeted him in the hallway. And that was the beginning of our friendship. And I remember how angry he was at me. And I said, Bob, I got 5 minutes there. He says, I didn't mean to embarrass you. Come back into the group, and he did. Anyway, it became clear to me that the concept of an outreach center was a viable one where men could go into their communities and have a place to talk to other veterans about the war, speak the same language, get help in different areas where they needed help. And that was sort of the basic idea at that time. That same idea translated to the DAV, and we then created these centers, 66 centers in 1978. And at the same time, I'm now working with Max Cleland and a group of people who had come together now at this point in time, who had been working in disparate ways, including Shad Meshad. That's when I met Shad at this time. And then there was a small group of us who worked with Max. It was Shad Meshad, myself, Art Eggendorf from New York, then later on Art Blank, and Rusty Lindley, who was a legislative person with Cranston, and who else am I forgetting? Anyway, that was the nucleus of the group. And our task for Jimmy Carter and with Max Cleland was to design a vet center program. So using some of the gains and insights I had experienced and developed with the DAV and the work in Cleveland, we designed the vet center program. And as you all know, it was launched in Los Angeles in December of 1979. And that was the birth of the Vet Center program. And as you all know, it's proliferated since then to in all kinds of different ways. And for the next 5 years, Shad was director of the West region of the VA at the time. For the next 5 years, I was Shad's principal training director in many programs on the West Coast. And those were very creative, interesting, exciting times because it came from the grassroots up. It was staffed by Vietnam veterans, working for Vietnam veterans to do the outreach, to do the counseling, and do the healing. And the rest is history. There's another part of the story I want to end with. It's a personal thing for me. It was something that was totally unexpected. And it was in the summer of 1979 that I received in the mail in an express package a document. And in this document was the bill that was passed. There was the Senate resolution of Senate Bill 7. And it was passed in June. It was signed on August the 12th, 1979. And what I got in the mail was a present from Jimmy Carter. He gave me the bill, and gave me the pen, and a presidential commendation. And it was awesome. I was stunned. I was simply stunned. And I've had the good fortune of having a lot of awards and stuff over the years. But I told my youngest son the other day, because he'd never seen it. I had it on the wall for a long time. My wife got tired of seeing it. She said, I'm tired of the Carter. I'm going to put it away for a while. But I showed it to my son Mike the other night. And I said, listen, There's a lot. When I die, you can have anything you want here. But there's one thing I don't want you guys to throw away. It's that, because that means the most to me. And that was the beginning of Vet Center.